Every year, people die on Mount Everest. Some are first-time climbers. Some have spent decades climbing mountains around the world. Some are accompanied by professional guides. Some have stood on Everest before. And yet, the mountain continues to take lives. More than 300 people have died on Everest. Many of them are still there. The strange thing isn't that people die. Everest is nearly 29,000 feet above sea level. It's one of the harshest environments on Earth. People expect it to be dangerous. The strange thing is how they die. Not all of them are caught in avalanches. Not all of them fall. Many die while walking. Some die after reaching the summit. Some die only a short distance from safety. And almost every climbing season, the same pattern repeats. That shouldn't happen. Everest has been climbed for more than 70 years. Its routes have been mapped. Its weather is monitored. Climbers carry satellite communications, supplemental oxygen, GPS, professional guides. The dangers are well understood. The warnings are everywhere. So why does the pattern continue? Why do experienced climbers make decisions that seem impossible to explain? Why do guides ignore rules they helped create? Why do people continue climbing when turning around would save their lives? Those questions have been asked after almost every major disaster on Everest. The answers are less obvious than they first appear, because the greatest danger on Everest may not be the mountain itself. After almost every major disaster on Mount Everest, investigators find themselves asking the same question, not what happened. That part is usually clear. The more difficult question is why experienced climbers made the decisions they did. One expedition in particular has been studied more than any other, not because it was the deadliest, but because it challenged something people believed about experience itself. On May 10, 1996, a guide named Rob Hall led a team toward Everest's summit. Hall wasn't simply another expedition leader. By then he had guided multiple successful Everest expeditions. Clients trusted him, other guides respected him. He understood the mountain better than almost anyone alive. More importantly, he believed in a rule that every serious Everest guide still follows today. Set a turnaround time. If you haven't reached the summit by that hour, you descend, no exceptions. The rule exists for one reason. Most people don't die climbing up Everest. They die trying to come back down. Hall knew that. He had explained it to clients. He had built his reputation around it. So when the turnaround time arrived, something happened that shouldn't have happened. He kept climbing. Eventually, he and his client, Doug Hansen, reached the summit. Neither of them would make it home. For years, people focused on the storm that followed. The storm was catastrophic, but it didn't explain the decision that came before it. Why would one of the world's most experienced guides ignore the very rule he believed could save lives? That question has never been about Rob Hall alone, because when investigators examined other Everest disasters, they found the same pattern: different climbers, different expeditions, different years, the same kinds of decisions, which suggests something uncomfortable. Perhaps the mountain wasn't simply defeating climbers. Perhaps it was changing the way they thought. For a long time, people assumed Everest killed in obvious ways. The cold, the wind, the avalanches, the falls, those dangers are real. But they didn't explain what investigators kept finding after major expeditions. Again and again, experienced climbers were making decisions that seemed increasingly difficult to understand. Turning around too late, ignoring worsening weather, continuing after running low on oxygen, separating from their teams. The pattern appeared too often to dismiss as coincidence. So researchers began looking somewhere else. Not at the mountain, at the climbers themselves. For decades, high-altitude physicians had been studying what happens to the human body above 8,000 meters. At first the changes seemed predictable. Heart rate increases, breathing becomes faster, the body works harder just to stay alive. But there was another pattern, one that appeared again and again in expedition reports. Climbers weren't simply becoming weaker, they were becoming different. People who were normally cautious became unusually confident. Simple decisions became surprisingly difficult. Some ignored obvious warning signs. Others insisted they felt fine, even when those around them could see something was wrong. Doctors kept asking the same question: what was causing experienced climbers to behave in ways that seemed completely unlike them? The answer wasn't hidden in the snow.
It wasn't the cold, it wasn't exhaustion alone, it was something every climber carried with them. Every step of the way, the air, not because there wasn't enough of it, but because high above the mountain, the air was no longer giving the brain what it needed to function normally. That condition has a name: hypoxia. And understanding it may explain why some of Everest's most experienced climbers made decisions that would ultimately cost them their lives. Doctors now had a theory. They believed the extreme altitude wasn't simply exhausting climbers, it was changing the way they thought. The problem was proving it, because no one can watch the human brain slowly lose oxygen. They could only study what happened afterward. Then, in May 1996, the mountain gave them a remarkable case. His name was Beck Weathers. Like Rob Hall, Weathers was caught high on Everest when the weather deteriorated. The storm trapped climbers across the upper mountain. Visibility disappeared, temperatures collapsed. One by one, people stopped moving. When other climbers found Weathers, he was barely conscious. He couldn't respond, he couldn't continue. The decision was made to leave him where he lay. Not because they didn't care, because they believed he was already beyond saving. On Everest, there are moments when rescuing one person may cost several other lives. His teammates descended. They expected never to see him again. Hours later, something happened that almost no one expected. Beck Weathers stood up, alone, more than 8,000 meters above sea level. He had spent an entire night in conditions that should have killed him. He was severely frostbitten, barely able to see, unable to remember large parts of what had happened, yet somehow. He found his way back to Camp 4, he survived. Doctors later studied his case alongside dozens of others from Everest, not because it was a miracle, but because it demonstrated something they had suspected for years. The mountain wasn't affecting every climber in the same way, it was affecting the brain. The question was no longer whether that was happening. The question became, how? Hypoxia simply means the brain isn't getting enough oxygen. On Everest, that process doesn't happen all at once. It happens slowly, with every step higher. The air becomes thinner, each breath delivers less oxygen than the one before, the body notices immediately, the brain takes longer. That's what makes it so dangerous. Unlike a broken leg or severe frostbite, hypoxia doesn't usually announce itself. Many climbers don't realize anything is wrong, because the very organ responsible for recognizing the problem is the one being affected. Researchers studying high altitude have found that oxygen deprivation can slow reaction time, impair judgment, reduce short-term memory, and make complex decisions much more difficult. The effects aren't always dramatic. Sometimes they're almost invisible. A climber forgets to clip a safety rope, someone ignores a weather update, a turnaround time passes without anyone acting on it. Each decision by itself seems small. Together they can become fatal, even more concerning. Hypoxia doesn't affect everyone in exactly the same way. Two climbers can stand side by side at the same altitude. One recognizes the danger immediately. The other insists everything is under control. That's one reason Everest has remained so difficult to predict. Experience helps, training helps, physical fitness helps, but none of them make a climber immune. In fact, many of the people affected most severely have spent years climbing at high altitude. Knowledge doesn't stop the brain from needing oxygen. And that's what makes Rob Hall's decision so unsettling. He didn't ignore the turnaround rule because he didn't know it. He ignored it while the part of his brain responsible for weighing risk may no longer have been working at its best. Doctors believe that wasn't unique to Rob Hall. It may explain countless decisions made on Everest over the last several decades. But oxygen is only part of the story, because even a healthy brain can make dangerous choices. When the summit is finally within reach, if hypoxia weakens judgment, it doesn't make decisions by itself. The final choice still belongs to the climber. That's where another powerful force begins to take over. Psychologists often refer to it as commitment escalation. The more time, effort, and sacrifice people invest in a goal, the harder it becomes to walk away from it. Everest is almost designed to trigger that instinct. Long before climbers reach the summit, they've already spent months preparing. Many have invested tens of thousands of dollars. Some have trained for years. Others have dreamed about standing on the highest point on Earth since childhood. By the time they enter the death zone, close enough to believe it's still possible. That's when experienced climbers often face their most dangerous decision, not because they don't weigh the risks, but because success feels so close. Researchers have found that when people become deeply committed to a goal, they often continue investing even when the risks become increasingly obvious. Each step forward makes the next step even harder to question. I've already come this far, I just need a little more time, the weather might still hold. I'll descend quickly. None of those thoughts sound reckless on their own, in fact. They sound reasonable. That's what makes them so dangerous. On Everest, disaster rarely begins with one catastrophic decision. It begins with a series of small decisions, each one seeming only slightly riskier than the last. a delayed turnaround, an extra 15 minutes, another rest stop, one more fixed rope, one more ridge, until eventually. The mountain decides for you. Looking back from safety, those choices seem impossible to understand. Standing on the mountain, they can feel completely logical. That's why investigators studying Everest disasters rarely ask a single question. They don't ask why didn't they turn around, they ask what made turning around become so difficult, and nowhere is that question more important than on May 10, 1996. On May 10, 1996. Everything Everest had been warning about came together. The climb began like many others. Several expeditions were making their summit attempts at the same time. The weather appeared manageable. The route was familiar, the climbers were experienced, but small problems were already beginning to appear. Teams reached critical sections later than expected. Crowds formed at fixed ropes. Minutes turned into hours. Every delay meant more time spent high above 8,000 meters. More time breathing air that couldn't fully support the brain. More time using precious oxygen supplies. Still, many continued upward. Some had already passed the agreed turnaround time. Others believed they could make the summit and descend before conditions worsened. After all, the top was close. By early afternoon, many climbers stood on the highest point on Earth. For a few moments, years of preparation had finally paid off. Then they had to come down. As climbers began descending, the weather changed. Powerful winds swept across the mountain. Visibility collapsed. Landmarks disappeared behind blowing snow. The route became almost impossible to follow. Exhaustion gave way to confusion. Confusion became separation. Some climbers could no longer find their teams. Others ran dangerously low on oxygen. Radio calls became increasingly desperate. Rob Hall remained high on the mountain with his client Doug Hansen. Both had reached the summit. Neither had enough time left. As conditions worsened, descending became slower with every step. Night arrived. The temperature continued to fall. Rescue attempts became nearly impossible over the next several hours. 8 people lost their lives. The disaster shocked the climbing world. Many blamed the storm, and the storm certainly played a devastating role. But investigators who later examined the tragedy noticed something important. The disaster did not begin when the weather changed. It had already begun hours earlier, with delayed decisions. Missed turnaround times, small compromises, one after another. The storm turned those mistakes into a catastrophe, but it didn't create them. That distinction changed how climbers thought about Everest forever, because if disasters begin long before the first snowfall, then surviving Everest depends on more than surviving the mountain. It depends on recognizing the moment your own judgment can no longer be trusted. For most accidents, the story ends with a rescue. On Everest, it often doesn't. More than 300 people have died on the mountain. Many of them remain exactly where they took their last breath, not because people forgot them, and not because no one wanted to bring them home. The reality is much more difficult. Above 8,000 meters, every movement demands enormous effort. Even walking becomes exhausting. A rescue team isn't just climbing, they're carrying extra equipment. Using more oxygen, taking greater risks. Recovering a single body can require multiple experienced climbers working in one of the most dangerous environments on Earth. Every additional hour spent in the death zone increases the danger for everyone involved. That forces expedition leaders to make an impossible calculation. Can one life or one recovery justify risking several more? Often, the answer is no. It's one of the hardest decisions made anywhere in mountaineering. Over the years, some climbers have become silent landmarks on the mountain. The most well-known was a climber nicknamed Green Boots. For years, his body rested inside a small limestone alcove along the northeast ridge. Thousands of climbers passed that spot on their way toward the summit. For many, it was the moment Everest stopped feeling like an adventure and started feeling real. Others were not so fortunate. In 2006, British climber David Sharp became trapped near the summit after climbing alone. Dozens of climbers passed him during summit attempts. Many believed he was beyond saving. At that altitude, even stopping to help for a prolonged period can place another climber in serious danger. His death sparked an international debate. Where does personal responsibility end? And where does the duty to rescue another person begin? There are no easy answers. Everest forces people into situations that almost no one will ever face. Situations where every decision carries consequences, even the choice to stop or keep moving. The bodies left behind are not reminders of carelessness. They are reminders of how little margin for error exists on the highest mountain on Earth. And despite knowing all of this, Every climbing season, new teams continue making the journey upward. Which raises one final question. If the risks are understood better than ever, why does the pattern continue? Today, climbing Mount Everest is very different from what it was decades ago. Weather forecasts are more accurate, satellite communication is routine, modern climbing equipment is lighter and more reliable. Commercial expeditions have made the mountain accessible to far more people than ever before. On paper, Everest should be safer, and in many ways it is, yet every climbing season, the mountain continues to claim lives. Sometimes the causes are familiar: avalanches, falls, altitude sickness. But when investigators examine many of the tragedies, they often find the same chain of events: a delayed decision, a missed warning, a summit attempt that continued just a little too long. In 2019, photographs of long lines of climbers waiting just below the summit spread around the world. Hundreds of people had arrived during the same narrow weather window. Progress slowed to a crawl. Many climbers spent far longer in the death zone than planned. Some reached the summit, several never returned. The images shocked people who had never seen Everest before. But experienced climbers recognized the real problem immediately. Every extra minute at that altitude matters. The longer climbers remain there, the less room they have for mistakes. And Everest rarely forgives mistakes. None of this means the mountain cannot be climbed safely. Every year, many climbers reach the summit and return without serious injury. They do so by respecting turnaround times, monitoring changing conditions, listening to their guides, and when necessary, accepting that reaching the summit is less important than making it home. That may be Everest's hardest lesson. The summit is only halfway. Standing on top of the world means very little if you don't have enough strength, time, and clear judgment to come back down. For all the advances in equipment and forecasting, the mountain still asks the same question it always has: will you recognize the moment it's time to turn around? Or will you convince yourself to take just one more step?